Okay, welcome back. This is part two of the lecture on the transition of Paleolithic to Neolithic art. So there's one point I just wanted to make a little bit more clearly. There's a thing in art called pentimento in painting. We see this in Renaissance oil painting. We see it in a number of types of paintings where when a painter works on a painting and they maybe build it up in layers, the under layers might be hidden and you can't see them at all. But then over time, as the top layer of pigment become more and more transparent, those under layers become more and more visible, and you start to see both kind of the ghost image of the first layers as well as the top layer at the same time. So that's what I was saying was a possible explanation as to why there's so much multiplicity in a lot of these images in these cave paintings. But another option might be just simply that they wanted to create the impression of a huge herd of lions, or that they wanted to, they really did want to create this impression of movement, of lions lunging as they're racing across to attack another animal. So, like I said earlier, the other major thing that evidence of culture that we see from Paleolithic art are what are have been called for a long time Venus figurines. We try not to call them Venus figurines anymore because um, it's the feeling of most art historians and archaeologists that Venus implies too specific a type of worship, as too specific a type of cult practice, and we don't know whether these are representations of a fertility goddess. And if they are a fertility goddess, they're clearly a very different kind of fertility goddess than the the Venus or Aphrodite of Roman or Greek mythology. Um, so these were small figurines, and so they were probably um, totem, meaning that like someone held onto them as a totem, as a thing to remember, like some kind of idea or some being, right? If they are representations of a deity, which they might be. And they also, we think they relate to some sort of ritual practice, so we might also refer to them as votive figurines. And it's some of them have holes in them that seem to indicate that, or even like kind of ring points at the top of them that indicate that they were worn. We don't have evidence for all of them being items that were worn, like around like a talisman type object medallion on a necklace, but some indication seems to be that some of them were. And so that's about as much as we know of their purpose. But I think the question that most students wonder often when they're looking at these is the kind of the why. Why would anyone represent the human body in which I think to modern eyes, to many young college students, looks really kind of a grotesque manner, you know, and the the prevailing theory once again is that these are kind of like extreme robust representations of fertility, and kind of like and the idea that maybe this is a earth goddess, a fertility goddess, is kind of a common theory that people go with. And then if you accept that idea that maybe to represent that earth goddess, this kind of like extreme accentuation of the aspects of her anatomy that are related to childbearing, related to fertility, and related to child rearing, are are part of that, or a necessary part of the representation. Um, and it's also important for us to consider the possibility that perhaps to some of these people living 30,000 BCE, these were considered very beautiful representations of the human form. Um, I mean, certainly they saw them as exaggerations and idealizations, but as an idealization that maybe accentuated what they thought were a beautiful part. If you lived on a diet where it was really, really hard to put on a lot of weight, um, then maybe an extreme amount of weight would have been considered extremely beautiful. So we can only guess. We don't know. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about the Venus figures is they're kind of, I'll skip the slide there. They are this transition that we see as we go all the way to to the end of the Mesolithic into the Neolithic, where the figurines become more and more stylized and more abstracted. And when we look at things like cycladic art, we can see that continuation, this idea of these female figurines becoming less and less about a very kind of extreme representation of a physical manifestation of fertility and become a much more abstract representation of those things. Like I think the Venus of Moros is, I think, just really a gorgeous work and is really amazingly beautiful, stylized form. Another interesting thing to note is that most of these are carved in stone, like the famous Venus of Willendorf, but there are some examples of ceramic ones. And earlier, when my research was not as strong as it, since I'd only found this one as an example of a ceramic Venus figurine, my guess was that this must have meant that we don't know whether it was purposely fired. But now I have found out since that there are a number of these ceramic vessels, and we are very confident that they were purposely fired. Figurines this small wouldn't be that hard to fire. You basically just need to put them under the coals of a really, really hot bonfire, and you could fire the ceramic to make these. As to how someone discovered that you could make fired ceramics, we don't know. But therefore, there is evidence that as early as 30,000 BCE, humans were making fired ceramics. There are other kinds of figurines that we have from the Paleolithic going into the Mesolithic. Many of them are animal figurines. Once again, I think the animal figurines can represent two possible, but maybe more, aspects about Paleolithic culture. One, they are probably evidence of the fact that hunting was extremely important to these people, that they made representations of creatures that hunted and made representation of creatures that they hunted, right? Especially the bison and the horse. It's pretty clear that Homo sapiens in Europe were hunting horse and bison at that time. But it is also quite possible that some or all of these are in some ways also representations of totem, of animals that are representative of a group of people. So like the cave bear might be that instead of a representation of an animal to be hunted. We also have other kinds of representations of human representation besides the Venus figurines. So we have this Venus head, which seems to indicate a very different kind of way of approaching the human body and a different way of talking about a human form as some sort of spiritual form. And whereas the Venus of La Salle seems more tied to these other Venus figures, but she's carved with this flat, but she also is carrying something. See, she has like this this horn, and the kind of the pairing of like a bull's horn with the crescent of the moon seems to be a repeating theme that we see at the end of the Paleolithic, all the way through the Neolithic and into early civilization. So that brings us all the way to the Neolithic transformation. Back when I was a student, we used to call it the Neolithic Revolution because it was assumed that the adoption of agriculture was the primary thing that spurred the change into the Neolithic. But we're getting close to my 9-minute mark, so I'm going to pause right about here. The last thing I want to say is that I want to just give you the terms we've been using. Paleolithic, right, means Old Stone Age. Mesolithic means Middle Stone Age. And Neolithic means New Stone Age. And it used to be that the Neolithic was strongly associated with agriculture. It was kind of assumed that the development of agriculture was the primary characteristic of the change into the Neolithic period. We now are starting to understand that that's not entirely true, that Neolithic culture actually began earlier, before people were truly agricultural. Okay, I'm going to end it there. See you in part 3.